This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor.
I have a sister in the promised land. I never expect to stop until I shake her hand. I'm not so particular about shaking her hand. I just wanna meet her in promised land. Lord, let me fly. Let me fly. Oh, let me fly to my Zion. Lord, Lord, I have the mother in the promised land. I never expect to stop until I shake her hand. I'm not so particular about shaking.
Those are the voices of Bessie Jones and the Georgia Sea Island Singers, singing some traditional Gullah songs. You'll hear from them throughout this episode.
Lord, let me fly to my Zion. Lord, Lord,
Juneteenth. I was unaware of the importance of this celebration for the African American community, at least until a few years ago. Juneteenth marks the date when the last slaves were freed in Galveston, Texas, after the Civil War. On June 19, 1865, Governor Gordon Granger read General Order No. 3, which began,
The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor.
according to Wikipedia, quote, early celebrations date back to 1866, at first involving church-centered community gatherings in Texas. They spread across the South among newly freed African-American slaves and their descendants, and became more commercialized in the 1920s and 1930s, often centering on a food festival. Participants in the Great Migration brought these celebrations to the rest of the country, close quote. The article goes on to say that civil rights issues overshadowed the celebration in the 1960s, but it started to make a comeback in the 1970s. In 2021, Congress passed a recognition of Juneteenth as a federal holiday, and President Biden signed it into law. There are now Juneteenth celebrations all across the nation. Of course, there are celebrations in Texas, but there are also large celebrations in Atlanta, New Orleans, and Philadelphia. One place where Juneteenth is important is in today's ghost town, Mitchelville, located on Hilton Head Island in South Carolina, the first town in the U.S. run by freed slaves. Early on the morning of April 12, 1861, Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor, sparking the Civil War. Only 7 months later, Union forces had captured most of the sea islands south of Charleston. In November 1861, Union soldiers defeated Confederates in the naval Battle of Port Royal Sound.
The Union fleet of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, consisting of 17 warships and 60 transports and coaling schooners, was the largest fleet assembled in American history up to that time. It carried approximately 12,000 soldiers, commanded by Brigadier General Thomas W. Sherman. Among the Union naval forces were about 600 Marines, and commander of the warship Pocahontas, Percival Drayton, the brother of Confederate Brigadier General Thomas F. Drayton, who commanded the overall defenses of Port Royal Sound. Originally planned as a combined Army-Navy amphibious campaign, the Union forces faced challenges when a storm scattered their fleet and caused the loss of vital landing craft, supplies, and ammunition. Waiting for favorable conditions for the invasion, they regrouped on November 5, 1861, and prepared for a new plan. On the morning of November 7, 1861, the Union column of 15 warships advanced towards the mouth of Port Royal Sound. The Union ships began their bombardment, and the Confederate forts offered token resistance. The inexperienced Confederate gunners struggled to inflict damage on the moving Union fleet. The Union fleet executed formation sailing in an elliptical pattern, circling between the forts and changing their course and speed, confusing the Confederate artillerists. The battle raged for approximately 4 hours, and the Confederate forces eventually ran low on ammunition and abandoned the devastated forts.
On Hilton Head Island, white plantation owners fled, abandoning their lands and their slaves. This was before the Emancipation Proclamation, so the newly freed slaves were called contrabands. An article in the South Carolina Daily Gazette gave this description, quote, "The U.S. Army occupied the Sea Islands and set up its Department of the South headquarters on Hilton Head Island, where wealthy white residents and plantation owners fled. They left behind their property, possessions, and, by some accounts, more than 10,000 slaves. Hundreds of the newly liberated residents, officially called contraband since they weren't yet legally free, sought refuge at the new base and were assigned to barracks. The freed slaves worked with the Union Army, unloading supply ships, washing clothes, gardening, and harvesting cotton, but now for pay. But as word spread, the barracks quickly became overcrowded." Close quote. One contemporary account recounted the following.
Negro slaves came flocking into our camp by the hundreds, escaping their masters when they knew of the landing of Lincoln's soldiers, as they called us, many of them with no other clothing than gunny sacks.
On February 6, 1862, Commanding General Thomas Sherman, no relation to the more famous Sherman, issued General Order 9, requesting assistance for the contrabands from the North. Edward Pierce, along with representatives from the American Missionary Association, set about developing a, quote, plan for the education, welfare, and employment of the former slaves, close quote, according to a 2001 Chicora Foundation study by Michael Trinkley. This effort would become known as the Port Royal Experiment. Beaufort County Park Ranger Chris Barr describes the Port Royal Experiment.
And so when the military came ashore for the purpose of setting up a supply hub, instead they found 10 to 15,000 now formerly enslaved people looking at them and saying, what's next? And ultimately, that's the story of Reconstruction. What's next? How do we go from being a slave society to one that isn't? And that's an experiment that began here in Beaufort in the fall of 1861 and early spring of 1862. And this experiment became known as the Port Royal Experiment. One of the first things that they began to do was to experiment with transitioning from slave labor to wage labor. And so they began to negotiate for wages. The wages are terrible. Let's not pretend like this is a get-rich-quick scheme or anything like this. The working conditions are terrible, but it is an important first step as we transition away from slave labor to wage labor. That sort of leads to the second part of the Port Royal Experiment here, which is property ownership. The position of the U.S. government at the time of the Civil War was that secession is not legal. And so they basically said, well, as all these landowners who abandoned the place, they're just U.S. citizens who are now delinquent on their taxes. And so they decided to auction off almost every acre of farmland, almost every property. They began to auction them off for unpaid taxes. So if you had been a formerly enslaved person working for wages on the cotton fields, working for the Treasury Department, or even working for the Army, suddenly you've got a little bit of money. You can go buy a few acres of farmland. The third part of the Port Royal experiment is arguably its most famous, which is building schools. But these schools are a really important part of the Reconstruction story. The next part of the Port Royal experiment here is recruiting black men into the United States Army. Black military service becomes the foundation of arguments about citizenship. And so as Union forces capture other areas, they look to Beaufort County as sort of the model.
Even with the assistance, many Union officers complained that the former slaves, quote, were becoming a burden and a nuisance, close quote, according to Trinkley. In September of 1862, General Ormsby M. Mitchell became commander of the Union's Department of the South, based on Hilton Head. He had a different solution. Mitchell decided to develop a town for the former slaves in a cotton field on the former Drayton plantation on the east end of the island. Before I continue the story, it's worth spending some time with General Mitchell. He was described as a polymath, a genius. He graduated from West Point in 1825 and remained there as an assistant professor of mathematics for 3 years. Later, he studied law, passed the bar, and became an attorney, and all this while holding several military positions. As if that weren't enough, in 1836 he became assistant professor of mathematics, philosophy, and professor of astronomy at Cincinnati College. Mitchell became well known as an astronomer and built the Cincinnati Observatory. He also published the first astronomy magazine in the United States and is credited with several notable discoveries. 2 different geographical features on Mars bear his name. But then came the Civil War. Mitchell led a division in the Army of Ohio, then moved to Tennessee before assuming command at Hilton Head. Now back to Hilton Head. Mitchell set up a contest between the soldiers and the contrabands to see who could build the best, most efficient housing for the freed slaves. The former slaves' design was the best, so Mitchell agreed that this would be the design that they used. Sadly, Mitchell was never able to see the new town come to fruition. He contracted yellow fever and died in October 1862, shortly after establishing the town. The new village was named Mitchelville in honor of General Mitchell. Ahmed Ward, executive director of the historic Mitchellville Freedom Park, described the people who lived in Mitchellville.
Mitchellville was inherently Gullah. Most of the people here were of Gullah descent. Gullah is tied to West Africa and other parts of the continent, and it's a Creole, K-R-I-O, which is a mixture of cultures. I always heard that if you're South Carolina, you're Gullah, if you're Georgia, you're Geechee. But Gullah comes from the Gola tribe in Angola, and Geechee from the Geechee in Sierra Leone. And so there's this direct link with West Africa. The culture is still very rich here in the Sea Islands. It is a culture that has maintained its integrity over the years. This park, again, used to be a plantation. The people stayed here for about 20 years or so. And it wasn't that they wanted to leave. It was like an experiment for its time. It was a place where people can come and be citizens for the first time ever, vote on their own situations, their own lifestyles, their own advancement. And about 1868, the Army leaves, and that, of course, changes the economy because they were working with the Army almost exclusively.
I've been walking a road a long time, oh Lord, long time, oh Lord.
By 1862, Mitchelville had nearly 1,500 residents. The town was laid out with streets and quarter-acre lots. Residents were able to purchase lots with enough land to grow some crops on their small plots. The newly freed slaves were given the opportunity to participate in a civic life that had been denied them. The citizens elected officials, such as a town supervisor and councilmen. They enacted laws, including laws regulating sanitation and community behavior, and a compulsory education law. The residents of Mitchelville established churches and a school. In 1862, the first African Baptist church was formed with 120 members and Abraham Murchison as its minister. By 1866, there were 3 churches in the town. Mitchelville was one of 5 school districts set up on Hilton Head Island in the 1860s. At first, the school at Mitchelville was run by the American Missionary Association. According to Trinkley, quote, "The teachers were poorly supplied, taught in churches lacking heat and school conveniences, poorly paid, and poorly housed. Their dedication, however, is clear. One teacher refused to charge her students the 25 cents per month tuition intended to pay for books, supplies, and so forth, claiming it was an unfair burden that would prevent many from obtaining the education they desired so strongly." Although the bulk of this educational activity was undertaken by white teachers, in 1869, the AMA teacher at Mitchelville had a black assistant teacher, close quote. There were several stores, and archaeological studies of the area indicate that the freedmen were able to purchase more than just the bare necessities of food. At the site were found ceramics and other higher-end goods. The former slaves were given a taste of consumerism and the ability to spend their own money mostly earned by working at jobs with the Union Army based on Hilton Head, such as hauling fish and cargo at docks, doing carpentry, and sewing. Trinkley's 1886 archaeological study indicates the absence of certain goods and pottery wares, not necessarily because they were unavailable, but perhaps because of, quote, "the freedmen's effort to distance themselves from the plantation experience, similar to their rejection of Negro cloth, and the hesitancy to plant cotton." Alternately, this may represent an attempt to emulate plantation whites by adopting the ceramics that they were not permitted to use as slaves, close quote. I checked the Bradstreet report for 1875, and it indicated only one African-American store on Hilton Head Island, owned by Gabriel P. Gardner. Gabriel's father, March Gardner, was one of the most prominent citizens in Mitchelville. March was one of the largest landowners in the village, having acquired nearly 200 acres. A 1987 article in the Beaufort Gazette said that March Gardner, quote, "was an illiterate colored man of considerable natural ability, who was a hard-working and prosperous man," close quote. March Gardner had 4 daughters, but only one son, Gabriel. In 1876, Gabriel was selected to attend the state Republican convention representing the town, and in 1877 was elected as a trustee for the local schools. Gardner ran ads in the local newspaper, The Crescent.
G.P. Gardner, dealer in groceries, liquors, dry goods, boots, shoes, etc. Hilton Head, South Carolina. Cotton gin and corn ground at the above place. Grist, bread, and feed always on hand. For cash, all orders will be promptly attended to.
For a few years, life seemed to go on in Mitchelville like any other southern town. Along with the stores and churches, there were even theaters. Yet, there were still challenges. For one thing, these, quote, Lincoln's soldiers were not as idealistic and benevolent as we have been led to believe, close quote, according to a 1987 article in the Island Packet. The article goes on to say, quote, the wages paid the black refugees represented a fraction of the wages paid for similar occupations elsewhere. The enlisted soldiers were envious of the special attention paid to the newly freed slaves. Licentiousness was widespread. The morals of old plantation life seemed revived in the army of occupation, close quote. In 1868, the Union Army withdrew from Hilton Head Island, and with it, the jobs upon which the citizens of Mitchelville had relied. Many switched over to subsistence farming. Many left. Sometime around 1880, the town ceased to be a true town and became a family-based community. The town's buildings began to deteriorate. In 1893, a storm destroyed many of the remaining buildings. According to the historic Mitchelville website, quote, on the night of August 27, 1893, a major hurricane, the largest and most powerful to hit South Carolina until that time, made landfall just east of Savannah, Georgia, with maximum sustained winds of 120 miles per hour and a storm surge as high as 12 feet. Hilton Head Island and Mitchelville bore the brunt of the storm. It is estimated that approximately 2,000 people died, mostly due to the storm surge, close quote. Even before the storm, disputes about land ownership arose, disputes that lasted until the early 20th century. In 1875, ownership of the Drayton Plantation, which was the site of Mitchelville, was returned to the Drayton heirs. The land wasn't ideal for farming, and the Draytons had lost any interest in the property. They sold the property to the Mitchelville residents. March Gardner, mentioned earlier, bought up most of the land. The Mitchelville website describes what happened next. Quote, March trusted Gabriel to have a proper deed made out. Instead, Gabriel took advantage of his father, eventually obtaining a deed in his own name, and then transferring the property to his wife and daughter. In the early 20th century, the heirs of March Gardner took the heirs of Gabriel Gardner's wife to court, claiming they owned what was left of Mitchelville, and that Gabriel Gardner had stolen the property. The court directed that a survey be made and the property of Mitchelville be divided among the heirs, upon each paying their share of the costs associated with the case. Close quote. Some of the heirs were not able to pay the court costs. Some were unable to pay the taxes associated with the land. Speculators took advantage of the situation and bought up much of the property. In 1890, the island had a black population of nearly 3,000, but by the 1930s, that had been reduced to about 300. By the early 20th century, Mitchelville no longer appeared on maps of the area. Nearby Fish Hall Plantation and the land that was once Mitchelville were sold to the Hilton Head Company in 1950. In 1986, a series of archaeology digs at what was known as Fish Hall site recovered many artifacts from the former town. This led to the site being placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1988. And that brings us to modern times. Hilton Head is prime resort real estate. Areas that were once plantation lands are now exclusive housing developments and golf courses, while waterfront property is almost out of reach for the casual property owner. However, the eastern part of the island remained a largely African American community. Even this remnant was under threat from developers. One now defunct real estate company wrote this on their website.
Mitchelville, South Carolina represents the last 300 acres of primarily undeveloped beach property available on famed Hilton Head. Featuring Hilton Head's most scenic natural landscape, the Mitchelville area, established in 1862 as the first township for freedmen in the United States, is now being redeveloped into a beach township specifically designed to cater to those seeking an active, upscale beach lifestyle in a relaxed, non-resort environment. The new Mitchelville will offer residents and vacationers an unparalleled island community where they can relax and entertain family and friends while investing in history. The exquisitely designed and custom-built single-family homes that make up the new Mitchelville will offer the ultimate weekend beach getaway experience and will surely be passed down from generation to generation.
Realizing the threats to the area, the Mitchelville Preservation Project was founded in 2005 to, quote, preserve, protect, and promote the heritage of Mitchelville, America's first post-Civil War settlement for freed slaves, close quote. I first heard about Mitchelville in 2012. In 2013, I was able to pay the area a visit. At that time, the only park in the area was the Fish Hole Creek Park. There was a Mitchelville Park, but it was a community recreation area rather than the historic area. There were trails through Fish Hole Creek Park with interpretive displays about Mitchelville, but the park wasn't dedicated to the town itself. There was a Mitchelville Beach Park, but there was nothing about the history of the town. Even while I was visiting, plans were underway for the historic Mitchelville Freedom Park. Since that time, Mitchelville Beach Park and Fish Hole Creek Park have exchanged places, or at least exchanged names. Fish Hole is now the beach park, and the historic Mitchelville Freedom Park now occupies the spot where Fish Hole once was.
Oh, Moses, Moses, don't get lost
In that Red Sea.
March your Lord and come across.
Oh, in that Red Sea.
Oh, Moses, Moses, don't get lost.
Oh, in that Red Sea.
March your Lord and come across.
In that Red Sea.
Let's just talk about the most like the Lord. Let's talk about the most like the Lord. Let's just talk about the most like the Lord. Let's talk about the most like the Lord.
One of the most recent additions to the park is a series of ghosted structures. These are, quote, metal frameworks representing the original homes, with interpretive panels offering insight into the lives of Mitchelville's residents, close quote, according to the park's website. The new addition includes a street grid that shows the location of the houses, according to an 1860s layout of the town. So in this sense, I guess Mitchelville has truly become a ghost town. The historic Mitchelville Freedom Park is now an active part of the Hilton Head community, holding events throughout the year. One of the biggest events is the Juneteenth celebration mentioned earlier.
Oh, day, gonna come day, oh, day, gonna come day, now, oh, day, gonna come.
This year, the event lasts from June 12th through June 19th and features gospel singing, children's activities, a drum circle, and a 5K run. I'll post links to the celebration and to other information that I used in this episode in the show notes. That does it for this episode. Next week, we'll take a look at another Freedmen's community, this time in the hills of the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Until then, please share the podcast with your friends and enemies, and be sure to rate the show. Thank you for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.